Hey, this is Ramon, channel is Alpha 4, and today I'm going to be doing a video responding to Paulogia, to his morality challenge for Christians, because there's so much wrong with his premises here when it comes to a Christian perspective that it makes it impossible to answer. Now, I've watched this maybe about 10 times, and I think the problem is when he's formulating his question or expanding on it, he adds a in-between green area, but he wants to know, basically, it's not an original challenge. It's the what morality can come from an area without God. It's like, can you get to morality without using God as your premise or as your source? Most Christianities don't claim that it's impossible to get to morality from a mortal or scientific or secular perspective, or even an animalistic perspective. Even animals have rules in their communities and in their groups. So yeah, you can get to morals without that. So the point that he's trying to make isn't really a valid point, because it's a conceit that Christians already make. But anyway, let's get into it. And some people are going to argue, because I saw it in some of the videos responding to this to his challenge. Some people are going to comment, yeah, well, there's so many different Christianities. How would we even know which morality to talk about? All right. So on that bookshelf out there that you can't see right now, I have books on traditional or Orthodox Judaism, Reform Judaism, Orthodox Christianity, that's Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholicism, Baptists, what they call Reform Christian or Orthodox Christian. That's not actually Orthodox. That's going to be Calvinism, secular Christianity, and then secular commentary, academic commentary on Christianity. And all the Christians that make claims to apostolic faith or traditional faith or Orthodox faith, all of them are going to go back to a thing called the Apostolic Fathers. Hold on. That's these guys here. This is translated by Bart Ehrman, by the way. Almost all Christianity that makes claims to traditionalism or to orthodoxy goes back to these people. There are some other people called church doctors, and depending on which church doctors you have, your interpretation of these people will change slightly. Almost all Christians, though, will agree that St. Augustine is a church doctor, or a doctor of the church, and you can take it from there. Really, where the disagreement happens is going to be on Martin Luther, John Knox, and John Calvin, and Wesley. But anyway, I digress. Let's go into Paulogia's challenge, as he explains it.
Please allow me to set a little bit of background in this video format. First, let's define morality, simply as evaluating actions against how well they will achieve some desired goal or outcome, a method of determining that some actions are more favorable than others. I hope that...
And then he actually gives a second definition. So it sounds like that first definition is his definition of morality, but it's not. He gives a second definition as well.
I'm going to call this Bible morality, for lack of a better name, and represent it here with a yellow circle. Even assuming that this yellow circle is the best and objectively right moral system, you must acknowledge that many people make their moral choices based on some other system. For the sake of discussion, imagine that this blue circle represents a moral system that wants to maximize well-being over the longest term and over the greatest scope of beings, and so will evaluate actions purely according to this criteria. Challenge to Christians. What is an example of something in the yellow portion that you think most non-believers would agree with instinctively? Presumably because it is both objectively true and written on our hearts.
Okay, so the biggest problem with his question here is that his threefold diagram doesn't work, because anything that's in the yellow that the blue would also agree with would automatically be in the green. So his question, his formalization as a question doesn't work. That was terribly worded and very boring, and it took about 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to edit that down, and that's only an 8-minute video. But I have answers. All right, so my definition of morality would be something more like this. The exercise of freedom in a manner that conditions practice in virtues and vices. Here's the Christian Catholic understanding of morality. You're wondering why I'm having trouble saying that? It's because usually you would say Catholic Christian, but you'll understand why the word order difference in a second. For Christians and Catholics, the definition of morality actually looks something more like this. This is the doctrine of original sin, redemption by Christ, lucid discernment, and free will. That states mortal man, without a redeemer or mediator, is captive to the power of death, and thus subject to animalistic temptation, for the sake of individualistic self-interest, such as survival, pleasure, financial, monetary gain, and the avoidance of pain and suffering. While ignorance of morality is ignorance of humanity's wounded and sinful nature that is inclined to evil and gives rise to serious errors in judgment, politics, and social actions. Now, if you notice, his definition of morality does not match the Christian definition of morality or the biblical definition of morality. There's a lot of presuppositions in the Christian understanding of what is right and wrong in morality that he's not bringing in to his formalization. In fact, his second explanation, which I think was a crap definition, and I'll get into that because I actually do philosophy, so I'll get into a more philosophical definition at the end. But his definition of morality as being that which has the most well-being for the longest amount of time for the most amount of people is not a Christian understanding at all. Let's talk about what a Christian understanding of morality would be, away from the Catholic jargon and dogma. A simple Christian understanding of morality would be something more like this: an obligation to justice and love by practicing moral and social virtues with the aim of fostering society and civilization under the help and guidance of divine grace, thus contributing to the common good according to one's means and the needs of others, and thus fulfilling sacred duties and social obligations. Now, if you notice there, Christian understanding here of morality is very different than what he's talking about. You're going to see that for a Christian, you can't have morality without some kind of divine influence, because we're talking about forms. We're talking about, and I'm actually reading Hegel right now, so it actually worked out really well. You're talking about forms, you're talking about the phenomenology of the Spirit here. So for a Christian, there is moral outside of your action. So it's basically like this, and I'm going to use three very small, very short examples. If you're a salesman, the thing salesman has existed before you were a salesman and will exist after you're a salesman. And there are certain actions and roles that a salesman takes. And if you don't fit and take those actions and roles, then you're not being a good salesman. Same thing with a teacher, same thing with a police officer. And that's why with a teacher, there are certain roles that a teacher is supposed to do. And if you violate those roles, you're not being a good teacher. You have a certain idea of what a teacher is. And by having that idea of what a teacher is, even though the individual teacher might be a stranger to you, the identity of teacher is not. So therefore you feel comfortable leaving your children with a teacher. The same thing with a police officer. You wouldn't just go to a random stranger for help in certain situations. But if that random stranger is now a police officer, they're no longer a stranger because you are already familiar with the thing that is police officer. The same thing goes with sword, the same thing goes with chair. And there's this sort of ideal chair or ideal sword or ideal hat. And everything's trying to conform to that form. Okay? That's what we're talking about here when we're talking about objective morality. We're not necessarily talking about God, but we're using a standard that's outside of ourselves as the measure of our morality, because we realize that our morality is limited to perspective. So let's talk about that. The Christian faith, or Bible morality, as you call it, Paul, tells us, the faithful, that we need to transcend individualistic morality through responsibility and participation in the broader community by seeking and fulfilling civic duty and by practicing piety. Do you see? So we always have some kind of outside system. And that gets more to the philosophical definition of morality. So the way that I could understand what you're trying to say through a philosophical lens, not a linguistic lens. A good secular understanding of morality would be something more like this. Morality is duty, responsibility, and obligation to conform to a set of principles and a system of conduct based on the virtues. Now, which virtues depends on which set of principles in which system of conduct. So that's my problem with Paulogia's video. He made it so broad
and so general
that he made his question meaningless. Not just his mistake of making the two circles and having them there and like, okay, if you already have a part that overlaps, then that's going to be the overlapping morality, not the morality that's only on one side or the other. Because things like abortion, things like gay rights, they're going to have a direct divide. They're not going to be, you're not going to get there the same way. People have an animalistic nature. If you're someone like me and you follow more Eastern philosophy, you're going to think of people as having a triune nature, which would be a divine nature, a human nature, and an animalistic nature. But even if you're just a psychiatrist or a psychologist and you look at human interaction, you're going to notice that people have more than one driving urge, and those urges compete. So your answer there doesn't really work, because anything that overlaps would already be in that green section. It wouldn't be in just the blue section or the yellow section alone. And if it's in both sections, then it automatically moves to the green section. Now, this part of the video is directly talking to Paul. So everybody else can just go. Just kidding. I've been wanting to answer one of your challenges for a while, but yet again, I disagree with the premise. This passage of written on their hearts is only talking about believers who submit to the will of God as part of the new covenant. Not that all humankind have some innate understanding of God, which can be come to by reason alone, which they do not. Every version of Christianity that exists, and even most versions of Judaism that exist, will tell you that you cannot get to the concept of God through reason alone. Therefore, you cannot get to the concept of God's morality through reason alone. You need a guide, or in this case, a guidebook called the Bible. The only people whom have God's law written on their hearts would be the elect, who have taken instruction and have answered the call, and thus they have been chosen. There's a Calvinistic understanding that's slightly different than that, but it works roughly the same way. God first chooses you, and then you choose God. Okay, is basically how it works. And if God chooses you, he puts his laws on your heart. And apparently doesn't choose everyone, even though he wants to save everyone. It's a whole complicated thing. It goes back to the debate again about free will and determination and predestiny and predetermination and predestiny. There's a whole bunch of debates about this stuff. The question for a Christian viewer becomes, who do you want to answer your challenge? Because who you are referring to when you say Christian changes the answer slightly. It is clearly not Catholics or Calvinists, as both Catholics and Calvinists believe in predestination, and Catholics then add a bigger complication by also believing in free will. So by believing in free will and predestination, that pretty much excludes your whole formalization of morality. So what are you trying to prove, and who are you trying to prove it to? Only the most fundamentalist and unread Christian would find any of your questions to be a challenge to their faith. You seem to be addressing some straw man biblical absolutist that no traditional nor orthodox, that's little t traditional and little o orthodox, Christian would claim themselves to be. To the point that you are insulting Christian believers. of all creeds and denominations. And by the way, for those arguing, well, how do we even know which Christian believes what? It's really easy. We have things called catechisms and confessions. So there's the Westminster Confession, there's the Augsburg Confession, there's the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Each branch of Christianity has its own. Each Orthodox or traditional branch of Christianity has its own catechism. And that is where you can find out what they believe and how they formulate their understanding of those beliefs. So it seems to us, the viewers, that you were only speaking to evangelical fundamentalists who also just happen to be creationist and literalist. And that is a very small subsection of Christians, because not all evangelicals are literalists, and not all literalists are evangelicals. I mean, you're having to get a lot of crossover to get it to pin down to a very small group to answer this question the way that you're formulating it. Again, I'm not hating. I like your stuff. And as a Bible-believing Christian, I'd love to respond to one of your vids, but I hadn't up until now because all of your challenges and all of your objections and stalls and whines don't mean anything to me. Because the thing that you're objecting to and you're trying to get a Christian viewer to agree with are things that I already agree with. I believe in evolution. I believe that you can come to a rational morality through
means of reason.
The truth is, I don't know too many Christians of any denomination or any religious background who hold to the beliefs the way that you present them. Are you only speaking to YouTube preachers and YouTube apologists, or do you have an actual target with these questions, and do you have an actual aim outside of just generally trying to get people to question their faith? Paulogia, Paul. I'm not saying that your questions are not challenging or that they're easy to answer, but I'm saying that they don't challenge faith. No matter what answer someone gives, it doesn't mean anything to the believer. I'm saying that yet again, one of your interesting questions is nonsensical, or at least irrelevant to Christian theology and philosophy. So I was talking with Shannon Q in the live stream that was being done by David Wood and some guy who you've done videos with. And with her guiding the challenge away from your formalization, I was able to answer the question, and I actually put an answer down in that chat. Look, you seem to be trying to show that ethics and here morals can come from a non-divine source. Yes, they can. So what? The problem with non-objective morality is that it becomes subjective and relativistic, which leads to a type of moral realism that can quickly justify anything and becomes meaningless in the face of two opposing moralities. That means that when a Hindu and a Christian start arguing about morality, your version of relativism or objectivism makes that argument meaningless, where you could either kill someone because culturally it's appropriate or not kill someone because culturally it's inappropriate. That doesn't make any sense. There has to be an overriding right or wrong. There has to be a final answer to whether or not what you're doing is objectively moral or objectively wrong. But for all of that, that is not the objection Christians have to your questions on your channel. Your questions on this channel, on your channel, show an ignorance of what Christians believe and a disrespect toward, or at least an unawareness of, the study and scholarship that goes into those beliefs. As I have said in other places, my personal morality is based on an Aristotelian Platonic ethos within a Stoic and Kantian framework that is then filtered through and adapted to fit Christian principles and biblical maxims. I don't know any Christian that uses a maximum good that causes the least amount of harm formula to measure their morality, to measure the morality of their deeds. I just don't know any Christian that uses that formula. For instance, and here's the example that I gave. So here's the answer to your freaking challenge. Marcus Aurelius would say, treat your friends as friends and your enemies as enemies. And on both sides of the formula, you're going to have people agreeing that, yeah, that makes rational sense. But Jesus here is going to say in the New Testament, But Jesus here in the New Testament is going to say, love your enemies and leave your friends if they cause you to err. This is an exact opposite of the understanding as it comes through the secular lens. So while both can agree the secular version makes sense, the Christian challenge here is much greater. Because the Christian challenge here is to love your enemies. Because even the pagans love their friends. Do something that's harder. Do something that's above what human nature calls to do. This is that divine nature. So it's saying, yeah, humans can be above animal nature. Any philosophy can get you above your animalistic callings. What Jesus is saying, okay, you've met that challenge. Now go above that. Let's be as perfect as me. Let's be as perfect as God. Rise up. Rise up. Try to be more godlike. You've risen your aim. You've risen your aim up to be more than animals. Good. Perfect. Now, let's raise that aim up a little higher and try and be better than other human beings. It's a moral challenge to sin no more. One is a call to natural nature, and the other is a call to divine supernatural nature. We are not arguing, we Christians are not arguing that consequences equals truth, or that life and pleasure equals right. In fact, we are arguing much the opposite. We are arguing that what is morally correct is true even if no one here on planet Earth thinks it is morally correct. And that even if the right thing leads to much pain, suffering, and death, it is still right. It is still correct. Also, self-sacrifice and willfully suffering for another, both of which are Christian virtues, would undermine your selfish, objectivist definition and origin of morality. All apostolic faith and the denominations that follow directly from it fall in line with the teachings of the church fathers and the doctors of the church. Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans all follow the teaching and understanding of Christianity and the Bible. So go read the Didache. Read the Apostolic Fathers. Go read St. Augustine and read St. Irenaeus. These guys created the tradition Christians like to debate about, the appropriateness of following. Find out what we actually believe first and then attack it. Otherwise, what you're saying is nonsense and not a challenge at all.